An ideology known as Stalinism has begun to grow in the West, not with any notable importance in politics, but with enough popularity among the youth that it's important to address the reality of Stalinism. The regime of Joseph Stalin has been treated as untouchable by contemporary communist circles, as any arguments against them have almost unanimously been decried as Western propaganda attempting to remove intellectual responsibility from the individuals who uphold this ideology and its historical implementation. Throughout this video, I will thoroughly break down every point at which Stalin and his regime failed at their most basic duties, utilizing primary and second-hand sourcing to demonstrate the abysmal and bloody failure of Stalinism in its home country of the USSR. Any critique of Joseph Stalin and the ideology of Stalinism should likely begin with a discussion on the topic of collectivization. Collectivization was one of the primary economic policies pursued by Joseph Stalin, which implemented full public ownership over the agricultural sector, removing the kulaks, or wealthy peasants, from control over agriculture. Stalinists frequently argue that without collectivization, the economy would have undergone too little economic development and millions would have starved. This is incorrect. Without the horrible failure known as collectivization, contrary to the opines of the Stalinist apologizers, there would have been consistently greater yields and farmland productivity by 1939 than there would have been, and indeed were, under Stalinism. During the Stalinist era, there was an objective drop in agricultural efficiency, as production efficiency, with labor taken into account, and with the amount of capital involved in agricultural production taken into account, also known as total factor productivity, was consistently worse than it was under the new economic policy, and not better in the slightest than it was under the Tsarist era. In fact, the Stalinist agricultural policy would only rival that of the Tsars by the early 1940s. This is consistent with the disruption of grain production within the USSR, the deportation and murder of the most productive peasants and kulaks within villages, and a decline in the number of livestock due to the disaster of collectivization itself, which resulted in a drop in grain production, which had formerly been used to feed the livestock. The graph on screen shows the extrapolated wedges for manufacturing total factor productivity and agricultural total factor productivity under both the Tsar and Stalin, with Stalin being represented by the straight line and the Tsar being represented by the dotted line. As one can see quite clearly, there's nothing at all impressive about the total factor productivity levels under Stalin's rule in the Soviet Union. The depeasantization of the rural countryside explicitly resulted in urban peasantization, as many fled the collectivized farms to the cities, which also tied in with the drop in economic productivity universally. Throughout the 1930s, agricultural output had fallen below the 1928 level, and there was a consistent deficit in agriculture year over year, which lowered urban and rural living standards collectively, one might say. Is this a revolutionary success in agricultural development? No, this is just pathetic. The wealthiness of the kulaks is a complete invention as well. The supposed wealthy kulaks had an average of 2 cows and a few acres more than their fellow peasants did. Not much more land at all. Strange standards, such as employing workers, was used as criteria for being a kulak. According to the ruling of the Supreme Court of the Russian Federation, number 31B989, all kulaks were denied of housing, all property, and voting rights. The initial acceptance by the countryside, which the Bolsheviks had enjoyed under the new economic policy, was completely decimated under the Stalinist government. The hoarding of grain by the kulaks can only be considered a reasonable reaction to the communist regime forcibly confiscating their property. So, was collectivization and dekulakization necessary? No, the state's monopoly over agriculture was just disastrous. Heavy state control over agriculture has always resulted in catastrophe. This disaster was due particularly to the end of the profit incentive. Who was to be incentivized to produce under the Stalinist model? The extraction and distribution of resources from productive sectors was mechanically planned with precision by a central planning committee. Security guards, police, inspectors, and accountants rigorously monitored the production processes, and therefore the production incentive was no longer one ran by profit, designated by market mechanisms, but rather by the force of the police. What Stalin had in effect introduced was a return to the serfdom of the Russian Empire. Farmers weren't allowed to leave the farm on their own volition, and the state would take the majority of crops produced on farms at very low prices, as any land or livestock which the peasants had initially earned was confiscated by the state entirely as the collectivization raged on. Other non-proletarian forces met worse fates than the kulaks. In 1933, 6,100 innocent individuals from the so-called lumpen proletariat were forcibly evicted from the cities and transported to an island known as Nazino, where they were starved to death while individuals who attempted to flee were shot and killed by the military until, in the end, only 2,200 people were left to live. The rest had died in the cold, starved, or been cannibalized upon. The Kazakh peoples, on the other hand, had their animals collectivized, bringing an end to their ancient way of nomadic life. It could have been true that the deaths of the Kazakh peoples weren't something which the Stalinist government was foaming at the mouth to achieve, but simply, as many scholars say, a price which the state was willing to pay for total control over the nation's agriculture. That could have been true if it weren't for the large number of Ukrainians in the region which had been deported there, which the Soviet government sought to eradicate. Some may view this as Western propaganda. However, it should be noted that the Ukrainians in Kazakhstan had the second highest mortality rate after the Kazakhs themselves, losing 36% of their population by 1933, as opposed to other ethnic groups, which lost only about 10% of their general populations. Over the course of the entire Kazakh famine, redistribution of damages led to the death of 1.5 million Kazakhs, again demonstrating the worthless and destructive nature of Stalin's reforms in their entirety. As Nicolo Pianchiola in the Collectivization Famine in Kazakhstan 1931 to 1933 states, quote, what was officially described as the expropriation of the property of approximately 700 owners of large animal herds acted as a cover for the indiscriminate pillaging of the entire rural Kazakh population. Moving our discussion away from the economic and towards the political front, it is undeniable that when one speaks of Stalin, one can't go without mentioning the Great Purge. The Great Purge killed hundreds of thousands of citizens of the USSR at the very least, a horror which none deny. The only question regarding the Great Purge pertains to its necessity, its efficiency, and its scale. It can be demonstrated without reasonable doubt that Stalin's Great Purge was the product of a substantive deal of paranoia, not material evidence of disloyalties or subversive elements in almost all cases. For example, 98 of the 139 Central Committee members elected to the 17th Party Congress of the Communist Party were executed during the Great Purge, hardly numbers that instill confidence that the Stalinist government was simply purging only corrupt officials. Supposedly, this was necessary, the Soviets said. Of the armed forces, 81 of the 103 generals and admirals within the USSR were executed. At least 700,000 members of the Communist Party were killed. Notably, the primary victims of these killings were original members of the Communist Party, such as Nikolai Bukharin. The official reasoning for the execution of Bukharin provided by the Soviet state was that he had aided in organizing a plot against the USSR's government. Bukharin was executed for this supposed conspiracy, which he was claimed to have admitted to, while those closest to Bukharin, such as his wife, denounced this confession as an absolute forgery. Anna Larina, Bukharin's wife, stated, but the most amazing thing is that despite everything, the time of shining hopes had not passed for him. He would pay for these hopes with his head. Moreover, one reason for his preposterous confessions in the dock, incomplete but sufficiently egregious confessions, was precisely this. He still hoped that the idea to which he had dedicated his life would triumph. Nonetheless, without anything to confirm this case, the conviction of Bukharin was based solely upon confession, if that. This isn't how real court cases work. Evidence is needed beyond verbal affirmation or even eyewitness to confirm that a crime did or did not in fact occur. Confession without corroboration doesn't matter, and corroborating evidence wasn't present within Bukharin's trial. After Bukharin's execution, Anna Larina, his wife, was sent to a labor camp. Stalin found humor in the deaths of many of the other members of the Communist Party, such as Grigory Zinoviev. Zinoviev's execution was recreated as a play and portrayed to Stalin, who laughed in the theater as Zinoviev's character met his demise while begging for mercy. A frequent talking point among the modern Stalinists attempting to defend the legacy of their dear leader is that the Gulag was far less bloody and held far less prisoners per capita than the United States prison system did throughout the 1930s to 50s. This is a very stupid opinion, as the Gulag was but a single branch of the USSR's entire prison system, and so to compare the entirety of the United States prison system with that of only the USSR's Gulag is just pathetically moronic. But let's entertain this idea. Even so, at their height, the Gulags held 2,500,000 individuals, 100,000 persons more than the entire United States held at the height of their entire prison system's activity in 2008, when the United States held some 2,400,000 individuals at once. These may seem like similar quantities, but when the size of the prison system is compared to the size of the general population, the disparity in active inmates becomes alarming. Most people know that the Gulag was a bloody system far less desirable than that of the United States. However, some members of the far left don't understand this simple truth. The following statement is for them. At the height of the U.S. prison system's number of active inmates, between 2007 to 2010, 17,358 individuals died while in custody. On the other hand, within the Gulag, 61,796 individuals died per year on average. What's supposed to be impressive about failing even more brutally than a modern neoliberal hellhole in prison statistics? I'm not quite sure. Let's not forget about the Katyn Massacre, in which the Stalinist government slaughtered 21,857 prisoners of war, and then proceeded to blame Nazi Germany as having executed the prisoners which they themselves killed, a position which cowardly scholars who hope to vindicate the brutal legacy of Stalin, such as Rover Fur, have taken back up, arguing that official Soviet documentation regarding the massacre is forged. Fur doesn't make any real argument as to why this document is forged. He only has the spine to point out oddities in the document, such as a new date being added at a later point. He lays forward no further argument for forgery. He proceeds to then, throughout his work on Katyn, misrepresent documents regarding prisoners of war and internees to attempt to back up his points. These lies should not be surprising from a pro-Soviet propagandist. However, it should be noted that in 1990, the USSR itself admitted to the massacre and apologized. To attempt to refute the USSR's own admission is a futile effort, I'm afraid. Many communists and Russian sympathizers nowadays deny the occurrence of the Holodomor by stating that the intentional mass starvation of the Ukrainian people didn't occur, or, on the other hand, that it did occur and simply was a mistake due to miscalculations in economic distribution. Both of these positions are equally as uninformed. The Council of People's Commissars and the Central Committee of the Communist Party demanded that requests for seed loans from Ukraine in September of 1932 should be denied, reasoning that apparently the government knew that there should be more than enough agricultural production in the region to ensure food sufficiency. One telegram reads, First, refuse all requests concerning seed loans. Second, forewarn the Soviet and collective farms that they will not be provided with seeds for winter or spring sowing. They were wrong, of course, as we all know that even the USSR officially reported starvation during this period. An exodus of peasants from Ukraine to Moscow and Belarus was reported in early 1933, and in response, Stalin demanded that the flights of the peasants from the countryside should be prohibited in all instances, stating, The CCAUCP and the Council of People's Commissars of the USSR have received reports on the mass flight of peasants for bread to the central Black Earth Oblast, Volga, Moscow Oblast, Western Oblast, and Belarus. The CCAUCP and the USSR Sovnarkom ordered the Regional Council and the official OGPU representative in the Northern Caucasus to prevent the mass departure of peasants from the Northern Caucasus to the other regions and entry into the region from Ukraine. The CCAUCP and Sovnarkom order the CCCPBU, Ukrainian SSR RNK, Belitsky, and Redens to prevent the mass departure of peasants from Ukraine to other regions and entry to Ukraine from the Northern Caucasus. The CCAUCP and Sovnarkom ordered the official representatives of the OGPU in Moscow Oblast, Central Black Earth Oblast, Western Oblast, Belarus, Lower Volga, and Mid Volga to arrest peasants fleeing north from Ukraine and the Northern Caucasus, and after the filtration of counter revolutionary elements, return the remainder to their places of residence. The so-called rapid industrialization of the Soviet Union during the late 1920s and early 1930s remains perhaps one of the most interesting economic developments of the 20th century. Many communists praise the industrialization effort of the USSR as a socialist economic miracle. The facts, however, are far less charitable to Stalin's economy. Far from practical opposition to capitalism or independent economic development, the USSR in fact leveraged foreign corporate capitalism to accelerate its own industrial development by engaging with American companies and utilizing credit arrangements, technology transfers, and managerial know-how. The Soviet state was only then able to modernize its military and heavy industry. Contrary to popular knowledge, the most important aspects of Soviet industrialization were its engagements with American corporations, which brought with them decades of experience in mass production and industrial management. Firms such as General Electric and the Ford Motor Company provided machinery, technical expertise, management practices, and training programs which were foundational to the Soviet Union's industry. On May 31st of 1929, a landmark contract was signed for assistance in building an automobile plant near Nizhny Novgorod. The agreement projected an annual capacity of 70,000 trucks and 30,000 cars. Ford not only supplied vehicles and spare parts, but also technical assistance through personnel exchanges and training programs that introduced American mass production techniques to Soviet industry. Under the leadership of corporate elites such as Solzhenitsyn Braun at the Amtor Trading Corporation, which was a quasi-private enterprise that functioned as the intermediary between American firms and Soviet industry, the Soviet state was able to secure contracts for the supply of equipment, technical blueprints, and even on-site supervision for factory construction, which was also aided by the American Austin Company. This collaboration jump-started projects in sectors such as automotive production and electrification, while introducing the Soviet Union's modern industrial processes that gave shape to their manufacturing for the next 2 decades. Through the efforts of the Amtor Trading Corporation, Soviet imports of American industrial and agricultural equipment increased several fold, enabling the USSR to purchase state of the art machinery that would have otherwise been completely inaccessible to it. Given the restrictions imposed by the US government at the time upon the USSR, direct foreign investment in the country was limited, so instead, the Soviets benefited from indirect investment, mainly through long term credit arrangements. These credit lines, extended by private American firms on favorable terms, were what allowed the USSR to finance the procurement of its industrial equipment. These engagements often involved staggered payments and low interest rates and provided sufficient capital to build the Soviet Union's new factories, its power plants, and infrastructural projects without the need for direct equity investment. When Solzhenitsyn Braun assumed leadership at the Amtor Trading Corporation in 1927, Soviet goods constituted only 0.3% of American imports, and Soviet purchases were a mere 1.15% of all U.S. exports. However, under Braun's management, by the end of March of 1928, total trade between the United States and the USSR had been increased to approximately 80 million USD, which was worth more than double the previous 6-month period. Within a year, the fiscal year 1929 to 1930 saw Soviet American trade reach about 128.8 million USD. By March of 1930, Amthorg had facilitated transactions with 1,700 American firms, with over 400 companies involved in ongoing trade, and of note, 104 technical assistance contracts were active in Soviet industries. The most apparent sector of the economy impacted by foreign capitalism was in the revitalization of Soviet transport. Prior to private initiatives aiding the USSR, the Soviet automobile and tractor industries were basically non existent. Through negotiated contracts with American companies like Ford, however, the USSR was only then able to construct its modern assembly plants, such as the one in Nizhny Novgorod, which would later become known as Russia's Gorky automobile plant. These plants imported American designed vehicles and received technical drawings, production methodologies, and even personnel exchanges, which allowed Soviet engineers and workers to acquire the skills that they needed for mass production. General Electric, yet another private corporation, not only supplied advanced electrical equipment and motors to the Soviets, but also established technical bureaus in Moscow, which supervised installations and maintenance. The infrastructural improvements essentially given to the Soviets by General Electric and other American corporations ranged from prefabricated steel elements for construction to improved transport networks. In a contract signed on October 9th of 1928, General agreed to supply equipment with a 5-year credit arrangement allowing purchases up to 26 million USD with a 25% down payment. By June of 1930, even the British government had guaranteed 150 million USD in credits for trade with the USSR over the following 2 years, and British corporations flooded to aid the Soviet economy with Imperial Chemical Industries supplying fertilizers, Armstrong Vickers providing tractors, and associated British machine tool makers entering into the trade agreements as well. After the World War was brought to an end, the Soviet Union experienced a rapid rise in birth rates, some might call it a baby boom, as its government prioritized industrialization. Its attempts to retain the appearance of strength in the eyes of the post war international community led it to reduce eligibility for ration cards that Soviet citizens relied on the year after the war ended, while raising the prices of foodstuffs. In order to project its strength, the USSR exported goods to its partners, which the internal population desperately needed in the face of an immense post war food shortage as a drought occurred. This drought, in effect, decreased yields for some products, such as potatoes and grain, by 60%. Not that it mattered, as the purchasing power of the average worker was extremely underdeveloped in the post war period, as wages had remained stagnant since 1940 and weren't keeping up with the government's price hikes for basic goods. A letter to the RSFSR Education Committee by a female principal of Shemin Elementary School states, I have four children as dependents. Three of them are in school. My husband died at the front. In October, I didn't receive bread cards for the children. What do I do? We have enough vegetables to last us a month. Commercial bread and produce are impossible to get. What do I do? Quit my job as a pedagogue, having 11 years of experience? It would be sad. It's a pity. I worked in the Urals for 6 years without arrest, forging victory, and now I have to die of hunger in my home village. Stalin's policies weren't revolutionary steps towards the end of history. They were unanimously catastrophic missteps. They devastated Russian agriculture, they decimated rural communities, and caused horrific levels of widespread human suffering. These policies destroyed the USSR's productive capacity and inflicted genuinely irreparable social and economic damage to the average citizen. Even the celebrated industrial advances were entirely reliant on foreign capitalist expertise. These facts show conclusively that the supposed triumph of communism within the Soviet Union was built on nothing more than propaganda and hot air, not a single shred of organic success.